Betrayed. The flames consumed my favorite dress, the smoke stinging my eyes. This can't be real, I thought, my chest tightening. Jack's voice, sharp and unforgiving, broke the silence. You think you're the victim here? You've ruined us, Emily. It was the life we'd built together. What would you do if a moment of betrayal unraveled everything you thought you knew about your relationship? This isn't just a story of mistakes. It's about the fight to save a love that almost slipped away. Stick around to see how we faced the ashes and whether we could rebuild from the fire. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your stories. The flames from the bonfire danced wildly, consuming the heap of clothes I had once cherished. My husband Jack stood beside it, his face a storm of fury. The incriminating messages on my phone had ignited far more than just fabric. I watched in stunned silence, clutching my chest as the smoke curled into the night sky. How did it come to this? How did my marriage of 10 years unravel in just a few minutes? It started innocently enough, at least that's what I told myself, a harmless text message. A familiar name, Liam. We hadn't spoken in years, but seeing his name pop up on my phone sent a ripple of excitement through me. We'd met in college during a time when life felt simpler and dreams seemed within reach. He was the what if I had long buried beneath the reality of marriage, motherhood, and routine. And earlier that day, I had been sitting at the kitchen table, absently scrolling through emails while the coffee brewed. Jack had already left for work, his usual hurried goodbye kiss brushing past my cheek like an afterthought. The kids were at school, and the house was finally quiet, a rare moment of peace. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from an unfamiliar number. Emily, is this still your number? It's Liam. Just thought of you today. I stared at the screen, my heart fluttering. It had been over a decade since I'd heard from him. Memories rushed back. His laugh, the way he'd always teased me about my terrible coffee order, the stolen glances during late-night study sessions. I typed a cautious reply. Yes, it's me. Long time, no talk. The messages started innocently. Liam asked about my life, my family, my dreams. It felt good, too good, to share parts of myself I hadn't expressed in years. Jack and I didn't talk like this anymore. Most of our conversations revolved around schedules, bills, or whose turn it was to pick up the kids. Liam's words reminded me of a version of myself I hadn't seen in a long time. Vibrant, funny, and full of life. But then the tone shifted. You always had the most beautiful smile, Emily. Do you still laugh as much as you used to? I hesitated before responding, knowing the weight of his words but craving the attention they brought. Not as much as I used to, life's different now. His reply came almost instantly. I can't imagine anyone letting that smile fade. The following weeks blurred into a haze of texts, each one pulling me further into a world I knew I shouldn't be in. It wasn't love, not really, but it was an escape. Liam made me feel seen in a way Jack hadn't in years. I told myself it wasn't cheating. There was no physical contact, just words. And yet, every time I locked my phone screen, guilt clawed at my chest. Jack noticed the changes before I did. He wasn't a man of many words, but his glances grew sharper, his tone more clipped. One night, as I tucked my phone into my pocket, he asked, "Who's keeping you so busy these days?" I laughed it off, but his question lingered in the air, unanswered. That afternoon, Jack came home early. I was sitting on the couch, my phone in hand, laughing at a message Liam had sent about our old college antics. I didn't hear Jack enter until it was too late. His voice sliced through the moment. "What's so funny?" I froze, my heart pounding. He was standing behind me, his eyes flickering to the phone in my hand. "Nothing, just a funny meme," I stammered, locking the screen. He didn't buy it. "Let me see," he demanded, his tone low but sharp. My palms grew clammy as I hesitated. Jack, it's nothing. His patience snapped. Before I could stop him, he grabbed the phone from my hand. I lunged for it, but he held it out of reach, scrolling through the messages. Time seemed to slow as his face contorted with every word he read. "Liam," he spat, the name dripping with disdain. "Is this who you've been sneaking around with?" "It's not like that," I cried, desperate to explain. Jack turned the phone toward me, his hand trembling with rage. "Not like that? Then what is this, Emily? You always knew how to make me feel special? What the hell am I reading?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. What could I say? That I didn't mean for it to go this far? That I never planned to hurt him? Jack didn't wait for an answer. He stormed out of the living room, phone still in hand. Moments later, I heard the back door slam. My legs felt like lead as I followed him outside, where he stood by a growing pile of my clothes, dousing them with lighter fluid. "Jack, stop!" I screamed, but he didn't flinch. The whoosh of flames silenced my protests, the fire consuming the pile in seconds. "You don't get to play the victim here," he said, his voice eerily calm. "This is what happens when you betray someone who trusted you." As I watched the flames, a sickening mixture of shame and anger churned inside me. I wanted to scream at him, to defend myself, but deep down, I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. I had crossed a line, even if I hadn't fully admitted it to myself. The realization hit me like a wave. This wasn't just about Liam or the messages. This was about years of unspoken resentment, unmet needs, and the slow decay of a relationship that neither of us had fought hard enough to save. In that moment, surrounded by smoke and ash, I knew our marriage would never be the same. The bonfire crackled, its heat pressing against my skin, even as the chill of the situation sent shivers down my spine. Jack's face was illuminated by the orange glow, his expression unreadable, a storm of emotions swirling beneath his usually stoic demeanor. The smell of burning fabric filled the air, mingling with the acrid scent of betrayal that hung heavy between us. I stood frozen, my mind scrambling for the right words. "Jack," I began, my voice trembling, "please, can we just talk about this? It's not what you think." He turned sharply, his eyes blazing. "Not what I think? So what am I supposed to think, Emily? You're laughing at messages from another man, messages where he calls you beautiful, special, and you're hiding it from me. How am I supposed to see this as anything other than betrayal?" The weight of his words pressed down on me. "It was just messages, Jack," I said, my voice cracking. "I swear, it didn't mean anything." "Just messages?" he echoed, his voice rising. "Do you even hear yourself? It didn't mean anything to you, but it meant enough for you to keep it from me, enough for you to give him a part of you that should have been mine." Tears stung my eyes, and I took a tentative step closer. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but please, let's just stop this. Burning my clothes won't fix anything." He let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and cutting. "Fix? Emily, I'm not trying to fix anything right now. I'm showing you exactly how it feels to watch something you care about get destroyed." The next morning, the house felt eerily quiet, as if it too was reeling from the events of the night before. Jack hadn't come to bed. I'd found him asleep on the couch, his back turned to me, the distance between us palpable. I busied myself with breakfast, trying to piece together a semblance of normalcy, but the sound of sizzling eggs and the clink of plates couldn't drown out the thoughts swirling in my head. What had I been thinking? Why did I let things with Liam go so far? Jack entered the kitchen, his hair disheveled, his face a mask of exhaustion. He didn't look at me as he poured himself a cup of coffee, the silence between us suffocating. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, unable to bear the tension any longer. "For everything." He finally looked up, his eyes heavy with hurt and something else I couldn't quite place. disappointment maybe, or the remnants of a love that had been worn thin. "I don't want your apology, Emily," he said, his voice flat. "I want to understand. How could you do this to us?" His words cut deeper than I expected. I fumbled for an answer, my guilt clawing at me. "It wasn't about you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was about me. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. Liam made me feel seen, even if it was just for a moment." Jack's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his coffee mug. "And you didn't think to talk to me about this? To tell me how you felt before running to someone else?" "I tried," I protested. "But you were always so busy, so distant. It felt like you didn't care." "Didn't care?" he repeated, incredulous. "I've been working myself to the bone to provide for this family. Everything I've done has been for us, Emily. And you turn around and—" He stopped, his voice breaking. The days that followed were tense. Jack and I danced around each other like strangers, the easy rhythm of our life replaced by awkward silences and forced civility. I deleted Liam's number from my phone, but the damage was already done. Jack's trust in me was shattered, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. I started therapy, desperate to make sense of my actions and the hole I had dug myself into. My therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Lane, helped me see the cracks in my marriage and in myself that I had ignored for years. "You've been carrying a lot of resentment," she said during one session. "Resentment toward Jack, but also toward yourself for not speaking up sooner. This didn't happen overnight, Emily. It's the result of years of unmet needs and unspoken frustration." Her words hit me hard. She was right. Jack wasn't blameless in this, but neither was I. We had both let our relationship drift, neither of us willing to fight for it until it was almost too late. Jack, too, began seeking help, though he was more reluctant to talk about it. I overheard him on the phone one evening, his voice low and somber. I don't know how to get past this," he said. "Every time I look at her, all I can see are those messages. I don't know if I can ever trust her again." Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut, but they also lit a fire within me. I couldn't let this be the end of us, not without trying to make things right. One evening I approached him while he was working in the garage, his refuge since the blow-up. "Jack," I said hesitantly, "can we talk?" He glanced at me, his expression guarded. "What is there to talk about, Emily?" "Everything," I said, stepping closer. "I know I hurt you, I know I broke your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I want to try. I want to fix this, if you'll let me." For a moment he said nothing, his hand unstilling as he set down on the wrench he was holding. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I don't know if we can fix this, Emily, but I'm willing to try. For us, for the kids." Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. Rebuilding our marriage would take time, effort, and a lot of soul-searching. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The following weeks were a blur of strained conversations and cautious interactions. Jack and I were like two wounded soldiers trying to navigate a battlefield littered with the wreckage of our past mistakes. Every glance, every word, every movement carried the weight of our shared history, now fractured. I threw myself into therapy, determined to understand how I had let things spiral so far out of control. Dr. Lane pushed me to dig deeper, to confront the uncomfortable truths I had avoided for years. "You keep saying that you felt invisible in your marriage," she said during one session. "But have you considered how you contributed to that feeling? How you might have retreated rather than reaching out?" Her words stung, but they were true. I had been so consumed by my own resentment, my own sense of neglect, that I hadn't noticed how much I was pulling away from Jack. I thought about the nights when I had chosen silence over confrontation, letting my frustration fester instead of expressing it. I thought about how I had let my dissatisfaction simmer, convincing myself that Jack should somehow know what I needed without me having to say it out loud. Jack, too, was grappling with his own emotions. Though he wasn't as forthcoming about his therapy sessions, I could see subtle changes in him. He started coming home earlier, asking me how my day had been, making small efforts to bridge the gap between us. But there was still a guardedness in his eyes, a wall that hadn't been there before. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Jack surprised me by asking if I wanted to take a walk. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. We hadn't done anything together, just the two of us, in what felt like years. We walked in silence for a while, the cool night air wrapping around us. The sound of our footsteps on the pavement was the only noise between us, until Jack finally broke the silence. "Do you think you would have stopped?" he asked, his voice quiet but heavy. "If I hadn't found out about the messages?" I stopped in my tracks, his question catching me off guard. I don't know," I admitted, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I'd like to think I would have realized it was wrong before it went any further, but the truth is, I don't know." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I think that's what scares me the most," he said. "Not knowing if you would have chosen to stop, or if you would have chosen him." "I wouldn't have chosen him," I said quickly, my voice firm. "Liam was never about love, Jack. He was an escape, a distraction. I see that now." Jack's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to respond, but then he said, "I'm trying, Emily. I really am. But every time I think about those messages, it's like a knife in my chest." The hardest part was rebuilding trust. Jack had always been the type to believe in people wholeheartedly, and I had shattered that belief. He started questioning everything: where I was, who I was talking to, what I was doing when I wasn't with him. It was exhausting, but I knew I couldn't blame him for it. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, he stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching me. "Why did you keep it a secret?" he asked. "Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy?" I turned to face him, my heart aching at the pain in his voice. "Because I was scared," I admitted. "Scared that you wouldn't care, scared that you'd tell me it was all in my head, scared that saying it out loud would make it real." His shoulders sagged, and he ran a hand through his hair. "Emily, I would have listened. I might not have known the right words to say, but I would have listened." The raw honesty in his voice broke something inside me. I crossed the room and took his hands in mine. "I know that now," I said softly, "and I'm sorry I didn't give you the chance." As weeks turned into months, things began to shift. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There were no grand gestures or sweeping declarations of love. Instead, it was the small moments that mattered. The way Jack started texting me during the day just to ask how I was doing. The way I made an effort to put my phone away when we were together, giving him my full attention. We started going to couples therapy, a move that felt both terrifying and necessary. Our therapist, a no-nonsense man named Dr. Parker, didn't let either of us off the hook. "You both need to understand that trust isn't rebuilt overnight," he said during one session. "It's earned through consistent actions. Emily, you need to be transparent about your intentions and your feelings. And Jack, you need to be willing to forgive. Not forget, but forgive." The sessions were uncomfortable at times, forcing us to confront truths we'd rather avoid. But they also gave us tools to communicate better, to understand each other in ways we hadn't before. One evening, after a particularly emotional therapy session, Jack and I sat in the living room, the kids asleep upstairs. The silence between us was no longer suffocating. It felt like a shared space, a tentative truth. "I think I'm finally starting to believe you," Jack said, his voice hesitant. "That you really want to fix this." I looked at him, tears welling in my eyes. I do, Jack, more than anything. He nodded, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The journey to rebuild our marriage felt like walking on fragile glass. Every step was cautious, every word chosen carefully. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, there were glimmers of hope. Small, fleeting moments where Jack and I began to rediscover the connection that had once tethered us so strongly. One such moment came on a Saturday morning. The kids were at a friend's house for a play date, and the silence in the house was peaceful rather than oppressive for once. I found Jack in the backyard, sitting on the porch steps with a mug of coffee in hand. The crisp morning air ruffled his hair, and for a moment he looked like the man I had fallen in love with. Relaxed, unguarded, himself. Mind if I join you? I asked hesitantly, holding my own mug. He looked up, his expression softening slightly. I sat beside him, the wood cool beneath me. For a while we didn't speak, simply sipping our coffee and watching the neighborhood stir to life. The quiet between us wasn't heavy, it was almost comfortable. I miss this, Jack said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. Is what? I asked, turning to him. This, he gestured between us, just sitting together, feeling normal. A lump formed in my throat. I miss it too, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I miss you. He glanced at me, his eyes searching mine. Do you? He asked. Because sometimes I feel like I've been standing here all along, waiting for you to see me. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'm sorry, Jack, I said, tears pooling in my eyes. I know I've been distant, and I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back, but I do see you. I see you, and I love you. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he reached over, his hand brushing against mine. I'm trying, Emily, he said quietly. I want to believe that we can get through this, but it's going to take time. I know, I said, gripping his hand tightly. And I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. The weeks that followed were filled with small victories. We started cooking dinner together, a ritual that had fallen by the wayside over the years. The kitchen became a place of tentative laughter and stolen glances, a space where we began to rebuild our connection. One evening, as we chopped vegetables side by side, Jack paused, his knife stilling midair. Do you remember the first time we cooked together? He asked. I smiled, the memory flooding back, the burnt spaghetti. He chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. Yeah, I thought you were going to throw the pot out the window. And I thought you were going to set the kitchen on fire with that flambé attempt, I teased, nudging him lightly. I was trying to impress you, he admitted, his cheeks flushing slightly. Well, it worked, I said softly, meeting his gaze. For a moment, we stood there, the air between us charged with unspoken emotions. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a reminder of what we were fighting for. Not everything was smooth, of course. There were still arguments, still moments when the scars of betrayal felt too raw to ignore. One night, as we sat down to watch a movie, Jack's phone buzzed with a notification. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the message. What is it? I asked, curious. Work stuff, he replied, his tone distracted. I nodded, but a flicker of insecurity crept in. I tried to push it away, but the irony wasn't lost on me. After everything I had done, I now found myself feeling the same paranoia I had once caused him. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't hold it in any longer. Jack, I said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Of course, he replied, turning to face me. Do you ever feel tempted? The words felt like daggers on my tongue, but I needed to know. His expression softened, and he reached over, taking my hand in his. Emily, I won't lie and say I've never felt lonely or frustrated. But temptation? No. Because I know that nothing out there is worth losing what we have here. Tears slipped down my cheeks, and he pulled me into his arms. I know we're not perfect, he said, his voice muffled against my hair. But I love you, Emily. And I want us to work. I love you too, I whispered, holding on to him as if he were my lifeline. Therapy sessions became less about rehashing the past and more about planning for the future. Dr. Parker encouraged us to set goals, both individually and as a couple. Jack started talking about taking time off work to focus on the family, something he had never considered before. I think I need to be more present, he admitted during one session, for Emily, for the kids, for myself. Hearing those words felt like a breakthrough. For so long, I had felt like I was fighting for our marriage alone, but now it felt like Jack was standing beside me, ready to fight too. One weekend, we decided to take a family trip to the lake, a place we had loved when the kids were younger but hadn't visited in years. The drive there was filled with laughter and music, the tension that had once consumed us, now replaced by a fragile sense of normalcy. As we sat by the water, watching the kids skip stones across the surface, Jack turned to me. "I think we're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady. I smiled, my heart swelling with hope. I think so too. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that we could heal, that the flames of that bonfire hadn't destroyed everything. They had burned away the lies, the pain, the mistakes, leaving behind the chance to start anew. The lake trip marked a turning point, but the road to recovery was far from linear. Jack and I both understood that rebuilding our marriage required not just effort, but also grace, the kind that allowed for setbacks and healing at its own pace. Back at home, life continued in its quiet rhythm, but there was a noticeable shift. Jack began spending more time with the kids, taking them to the park or helping with their homework. Watching him laugh with them, his guard down, reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I found Jack in the garage, his sanctuary. He was working on an old wooden bench, sanding it down with a focus that seemed to calm him. I hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "Do you want some help?" I asked, my voice soft. He looked up, surprised but not unkindly. "You know how to sand wood?" "No," I admitted, a small smile tugging at my lips. "But I can learn." He handed me a piece of sandpaper, his fingers brushing against mine. "Start with the grain," he said, demonstrating. I mimicked his movements, the repetitive action grounding me. For a while, we worked in silence, the sound of the sandpaper against wood filling the space. Finally, Jack spoke. "I've been thinking about us, about everything." I glanced at him, waiting. I realized something, he continued, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I've spent so much time being angry at you, at myself, at how things turned out. But anger isn't going to fix anything." "What will?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Forgiveness," he said simply. "Not just for you, but for me too." The weight of his words settled over me. I set the sandpaper down and turned to him, my eyes searching his. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Jack, but I'm so grateful for it." He nodded, his gaze holding mine. "We both made mistakes, Emily, but if we keep looking back, we'll never move forward." Our anniversary was approaching, a day I had dreaded since the fallout. I didn't expect us to celebrate. It seemed like too much, too soon, but a few days before, Jack surprised me. "I was thinking we could go out," he said one evening, his tone casual but his eyes cautious. "Just the two of us." I blinked, caught off guard. "You mean, like a date?" He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, like a date." The idea filled me with both excitement and nerves. It had been so long since we'd gone anywhere together that wasn't a family obligation or therapy session. But I agreed, hoping it would be a step toward reclaiming what we'd lost. On the night of our anniversary, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, trying to decide what to wear. Most of my clothes had been destroyed in the bonfire, but I had picked up a few new items since then. I chose a simple dress. Nothing fancy, but it felt right. When I walked into the living room, Jack was waiting for me. He had traded his usual casual attire for a button-down shirt and slacks. He looked handsome, and for the first time in months, I saw a flicker of the spark that had drawn me to him all those years ago. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice sincere. I blushed, a warmth spreading through me. "You don't look so bad yourself." We went to a small, cozy restaurant in town, the kind of place we used to love before life got in the way. Over dinner, we talked, not about the kids or the house or the logistics of daily life, but about us, our dreams, our fears, the things we had forgotten to share with each other. Jack reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice steady. "No matter how hard things get, I'm not giving up on us. I'm not giving up on you." Tears welled in my eyes, and I squeezed his hand. "I'm not giving up either, Jack. I'll do whatever it takes to make this work." For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Fragile but real. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a new beginning, one we had both fought for. The following weekend, Jack surprised me again. He called me into the living room where a large box sat waiting. "What's this?" I asked, eyeing it curiously. "Open it," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lip. I knelt down, lifting the lid. Inside were clothes, simple but beautiful pieces that felt like a gift of understanding. Tears filled my eyes as I looked up at him. I thought you'd want a fresh start," he said, his voice soft. "It's not about replacing what was lost. It's about moving forward." I stood and wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. In the weeks that followed, the tension between us began to fade. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, still scars that hadn't fully healed. But there was also laughter, kindness, and an unspoken commitment to rebuild what we had almost lost. One night as we lay in bed, Jack turned to me. "Do you think we'll ever stop being afraid? Stop wondering if this will all fall apart again?" I thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I think that's okay, because it means we'll never take this for granted again." He nodded, pulling me closer. "I can live with that." Epilogue. Months later, I found myself reflecting on everything we had been through. The fire that had consumed my clothes that night felt symbolic now, a burning away of the lies, the pain, the parts of ourselves we had let fester for too long. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real, and as I sat beside Jack watching the kids play in the yard, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. We had faced the fire and come out stronger, and for the first time in years I truly believed we could make it. As the weeks passed, Jack and I settled into a fragile peace. The routines we'd built, date nights, open conversations, and therapy, became the scaffolding that held us together. Yet beneath the surface, I could sense something shifting. Jack was more attentive, more present, but there was an unspoken tension in his eyes that he couldn't hide. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Jack approached me in the kitchen. His expression was serious, his jaw tight, as if he were holding back words he didn't know how to say. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but low, "I need to tell you something." I froze, the glass of water in my hand trembling slightly. "What is it?" I asked, my stomach nodding. He took a deep breath, leaning against the counter. "I've been keeping something from you." A chill ran through me. After everything we'd been through, the idea that Jack might have secrets of his own felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust we'd been working so hard to rebuild. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "The night I found those messages on your phone, it wasn't the first time I suspected something was going on." I blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" He sighed, his gaze meeting mine with a mix of guilt and resolve. "A few weeks before that, I went through your phone while you were asleep." His confession hit me like a punch to the chest. "You? What?" "I know it was wrong," he said quickly. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And when I saw Liam's messages, I didn't know what to do. I stepped back, the weight of his words sinking in. "So, you knew before you confronted me?" He nodded. I didn't want to believe it, Emily. I told myself I was overreacting, that I could just ignore it. But then I saw you laughing at your phone that day, and I couldn't hold it in anymore. I stared at him, a mix of anger and hurt bubbling to the surface. "Why didn't you say something then? Why let it escalate to everything that happened?" "Because I was scared," he admitted. "Scared that if I brought it up, you'd deny it, or worse, that you'd tell me you wanted out." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to scream, to accuse him of breaking my trust. But the irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. After all, I had been the one to betray him first. The revelation hung over us like a storm cloud in the days that followed. It reopened wounds we had barely begun to heal, forcing us to confront the lingering doubts and insecurities that had been festering beneath the surface. During our next therapy session, I brought it up, unable to keep the resentment from seeping into my voice. "He went through my phone before the confrontation," I told Dr. Parker. "How am I supposed to trust him when he couldn't trust me?" Dr. Parker leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Emily, trust is a two-way street. But let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here. Jack's actions, while invasive, were driven by fear and a sense of betrayal, just as your actions were. The question isn't about who's right or wrong, it's about whether you can rebuild from this together." Jack looked at me, his expression remorseful. "I know what I did was wrong," he said. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if I have to. But I need you to know that I did it because I love you, Emily. Because I couldn't stand the thought of losing you." His words softened something in me. I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I don't want to lose you either," I said, my voice trembling. "But we can't keep holding on to the past if we want to move forward." That night, Jack and I sat on the couch, a glass of wine in each of our hands. The television flickered in the background, but neither of us was paying attention. Instead, we talked, really talked, about everything we had been holding back. "I think I've spent so much time being angry that I forgot how to be vulnerable," I admitted. "It's easier to blame you than to admit how scared I've been." Jack nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I think I did the same thing. I was so focused on what you did wrong that I didn't stop to think about how I might have pushed you away." As the conversation flowed, something shifted between us. For the first time in months, it felt like we were truly seeing each other. Not as the people we had hurt, but as the people we wanted to become. A week later, Jack surprised me again. He handed me a small, wrapped box with a sheepish smile. "What's this?" I asked, curious. "Just open it," he said, his tone light, but his eyes serious. I unwrapped the box, my breath catching as I saw what was inside. It was a charm bracelet, each charm carefully chosen, a tiny house for our home, a heart for our love, and a flame, its meaning unspoken but clear. I know it'll take time to rebuild what we've lost, Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. But I wanted you to know that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere. Tears streamed down my face as I clasped the bracelet around my wrist. I love you, Jack, I whispered, more than anything. He pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole. The twist wasn't in the betrayal or the discovery. It was in the realization that healing doesn't come from forgetting the past. It comes from facing it together. And as Jack and I stood in the ashes of what we had nearly lost, we found something unexpected. A love that was scarred but stronger than before.